Thank you, Renee, and thank you to the National Institute on Aging for inviting me to speak today. So I'll be giving a bit of a lifespan approach to looking at behavioral interventions in adulthood, particularly mindfulness interventions. And so I think a lot of us are aware that adversity in childhood can impact health trajectories across the life course. So say, for example, socioeconomic adversity in childhood can impact, or at least is associated with all-cause mortality later on in life, as this systematic review showed in 22 studies. We can also think about adverse childhood experiences. So this is a different type of adversity related to things like abuse in the home or neglect or household dysfunction. And this is sort of a newer area of research that's had some pretty compelling findings. This study of 17,000 participants showed a dose-response association that for those with the very highest level of different types of adverse childhood experiences they were exposed to, they had a 3.6-fold higher odds of ischemic heart disease compared to those with the lowest levels, and you can see a dose-response association. We tried to replicate those findings in the Cardia study using the Risky Family questionnaire, and found that for every 10-point increase in the Risky Family score, there was a 10% increase in 10-year risk for coronary heart disease, as measured using the Framingham risk algorithm. And so, I spent sort of the first 10 years of my career sort of documenting social disparities in cardiovascular disease and the biological mechanisms, and where I came to after that was, well, they exist, and what are we going to do about it? And so that's where I'm dedicating a lot of my research towards right now. It's also where NIH is also dedicating resources. So this was an RFA that came out a few years ago around midlife reversibility of early life adversity or early life determinants of health. There's also been the Science of Behavior Change research network that has really focused a lot on how do we help people change their behaviors across the lifespan in ways that can improve their trajectories of health throughout their lives. And so we were lucky and grateful to get funding for both of these RFAs, and so I'll be presenting some of our preliminary findings from those. And so, when we start to think about mindfulness, is this potentially a way to reduce social disparities in cardiovascular disease? And furthermore, what is mindfulness? And so these are some standard definitions here. I often describe it as sort of present moment awareness of our thoughts, our emotions, our physical sensations in a non-judgmental way, sort of curiosity, acceptance, gentleness. It's almost like just data coming in. Where are my thoughts right now? Is that interesting? Are they there a fair bit at a time? Is there something new about them? The physical sensations. And as we start to come to know ourselves that much better, we start to see sort of the quality of our experience. And we also start to see what comes into influencing the quality of that experience. And so we can often start potentially to make changes to put our experience into more positive directions for a greater amount of our lives. And so that's sort of the idea behind it. In terms of the data behind it, there's been a fair bit of research in mental health, particularly around relapse of depression. And so this is a study that came out in the Lancet just last year. There was a randomized controlled trial of mindfulness-based cognitive therapy versus antidepressants with a 2-year follow-up, showing pretty equivalency of effect, where both worked pretty well to prevent relapse of depression. One of the interesting things that came out of this study, though, was a significant interaction with early life adversity, specifically childhood abuse. So that there's evidence that this intervention, the mindfulness intervention, was actually more effective than antidepressants for people that had been exposed to childhood abuse. And maybe the antidepressants are more effective than the mindfulness intervention for those that haven't been exposed to childhood abuse. And which makes some sense in terms of the actual mechanisms of those two quite different interventions. One of the nice things about this study is it was actually a replication of a previous randomized control trial that also showed a significant interaction with childhood abuse. So there's 2 different studies of different groups that have shown similar things. And so we've started to look at it around cardiovascular disease. And so we published last year the first consensus-based theoretical framework of how mindfulness might influence cardiovascular disease, and specifically the mechanisms around that. And then this talk is specifically customized towards blood pressure. And so one of the projects that we had funded recently, just in the fall, was to develop this mindfulness-based blood pressure reduction. That's the first ever customized mindfulness intervention designed to reduce blood pressure specifically. And so we started to look at sort of the different mechanisms of how it could happen. How could mindfulness meditation influence blood pressure? It's probably not magic, and so there must be something going on mechanistically to do it. And so there's sort of three realms of self-regulation that have evidence to be related to mindfulness meditation to be influenced. One is attention control. So with meditation, we're coming back to our breath or to the object of meditation over and over again, and the mind wanders, and that's just what the mind does, and then we just notice where it's wandering and keep bringing it back. And just sort of like a muscle that we train in the gym, we're training our brain to enhance our attention control. With self-awareness, we're also starting to notice, well, where are our thoughts and our physical sensations and our emotions, and that self-awareness starts to increase as we're practicing that. And so then can we start to become more self-aware in all areas of our lives. The third piece is around emotion regulation, so that we're actually training people to create a new coping strategy in their lives that can be there to help with stressful circumstances. And so it seems that these three may sort of interact with each other, and then basically, and we train people up in that very early on. It's based off of mindfulness-based stress reduction, which is a standard intervention. I'm a certified instructor in that realm, and then we basically customize it to bring people's awareness to the determinants of blood pressure. So we actually bring their awareness, this enhanced attention control, towards the relationship with physical activity, the relationship with diet, or the relationship with all the things that influence blood pressure, including blood pressure medication use. And so we actually start to bring them through in the course where they actually engage in physical activity in class, and we start to bring their awareness of their thoughts, emotions, and physical sensations before they engage, right before they engage in physical activity. And some people kind of get a little edgy around that, where they don't really want to do it. And some people are excited, and other people aren't. And then we're bringing their awareness while they're actually doing the physical activities, usually walking or jogging, depending on what their body's capable of, and noticing those thoughts, physical sensations, emotions as they're actually doing the activity itself. And for some people, it's going pretty well, and others not as well. And then afterwards, we're bringing their awareness for the hour or two after they've completed the exercise, and that's when most people start to feel really good. Most people feel really good for hours after they're physically active. And so we're starting to bring mindful awareness to each and every moment of our lives, but this moment is influenced by how much physical activity that we got today. It's influenced by what we ate for lunch. It's influenced by our early life experiences. And so we start to bring that in to the intervention itself. And so, we just got the grant in September, and so this is you are the first people in the world to see our preliminary results. So this is just a 3-month follow-up. We'll be following up to a year. It's a sample size of 11, so take this with a major grain of salt. Since it's blood pressure, you should probably take it with a major leaf of kale instead of salt, or something to increase blood pressure. But basically what we're finding after 3 months is a reduction of about 9 millimeters of mercury systolic blood pressure in the groups pre-post, which I was honestly pleased to see. But where things got interesting is when we stratified by uncontrolled hypertension status versus pre-hypertension. So for those participants with uncontrolled hypertension, so blood pressure, systolic blood pressure over 140, their blood pressure came down 24 millimeters of mercury in 3 months, which I am having trouble believing, to be honest. It seems too good to be true. And so we'll be getting more sample size coming in over the months. We'll have 5-fold the sample size by Christmas to see if it has an effect. And you can see for those with pre-hypertension that there's not much change at all, if anything, a little bit of an increase. And so this is similar to mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, where it really seems to work in those that have relapsed to depression at least 3 times. Those who haven't relapsed up to 3 times, it's not as effective. And so is it for people that the current medical regimen is not working, that mindfulness may be a way to help it work? And that's sort of an open question with some very preliminary findings that we have here. We also stratified by adverse childhood experience score, and so we found that for those that had a fairly low exposure to adverse childhood experiences, a score of less than 2, that systolic blood pressure came down by about 6 millimeters of mercury. For those with greater exposure, with more than 2 different categories, or 2 or more different categories of adverse childhood experiences, it came down 12 millimeters of mercury, so it came down twice as much in the people who had adverse childhood experiences versus who didn't. So that's also consistent with the findings of depression. And again, it's very early on, and it's too early to tell if it's really meaningful or not, but that's what we're getting. And so, that's sort of how things are related to blood pressure, this distal outcome, but we're using the NIH stage model for intervention development, where we're really heavily focused on the mechanisms. And so we're measuring attention control and self-awareness and emotion regulation and all these things here. And I'm actually customizing the intervention itself to engage with those targets, to engage with those target mechanisms. And that allows us to not magically think of how blood pressure, how mindfulness meditation could influence blood pressure distally, but how could it influence it proximately through these pathways. And so here's some of our preliminary findings in self-awareness, where we're using a multidimensional assessment of interoceptive awareness. Overall, the interoceptive awareness is increasing a little bit. As you can see here, again, this is a sample size of 11. But we're actually interested in some particular specific areas of self-awareness, including body awareness. And so here we're actually seeing a bit of a bigger increase in body awareness, in particular, that particular subscore. If we look at it around emotional regulation, the difficulties in emotional regulation scale, it is coming down somewhat. If we look at the non-acceptance of emotional responses, we see that's not changing. And with mindfulness, like, acceptance is kind of important. And so this is suggesting to me that maybe I need to crank that up in my intervention. Maybe we're not targeting that enough, and so maybe I should be increasing my intervention to actually target acceptance even more. If we can look at the difficulty in engaging goal-directed behavior, we see that that's actually coming down. You know, sample size is 11 and a P of 0.08. That's a reasonable reduction. So we're doing motivational interviewing in this intervention and trying to use mindful awareness but still set goals. And so it seems like maybe that piece is actually going pretty well. And so this is an example of how we're using that NIH stage model to really measure these mechanisms to see how well we're engaging with those targets, with the hope that it also influences the distal outcome of blood pressure. So we're measuring all of them, but we can have this quick recursive shifting of our intervention to see if we can better engage the targets. And so overall, it seems like there is some evidence that mindfulness-based interventions might help mitigate some of the effects of early life adversity. I'm getting more convinced, especially in the depression literature. It's very early on in the cardiovascular literature, but now that there's been some replication in the depression literature, starting to be more convinced. And then also utilizing this NIH stage model. And the author of that was in the room earlier today, Lisa Ogden is here. You know, that can really allow for quite rapid feedback. Oh, she is not. So she's available for better answers than me on this model. And it can give us pretty quick feedback on what the effects of the intervention, and also allow us to fairly quickly adapt our intervention to better engage with the targets. I'd just like to thank all my collaborators. And this team here is rapidly at Brown University right now, getting the baseline assessments of our cohort of 20 participants that are coming through this summer, and a lot of gratitude to NIH for funding.